Okay, everybody. Thank you and welcome to the Confronting Coloniality in Indian Psychology and Psychology in India speaker series. It's brought to you by Dr. Betty's Counseling, Psychotherapy, Research and Teaching Service Lab in partnership with Dr. Sunil Varma from the University of Delhi, and funding has been provided by the Shastri Indian-Canadian Institute. Okay. The purpose of the series is to better mobilize knowledge about coloniality in Indian psychology and psychology in India, in both Canada and India in particular, and promote its application not only in India and Canada, but globally. More specifically, the speaker series adopts a decolonizing framework and aims to investigate, deconstruct, and confront the colonial manifestation of Euro-American psychology in the Indian national context. It is hoped that the end result of the speaker series is greater societal awareness of the legacy of colonialism on contemporary Indian psychology and further decolonization of Indian psychology and psychology in India. So as some introductory comments here, although the official colonization of India is long over, the legacy of colonialism lingers on in India and in the mentality and lived experience of many Indians all over the world. Partially through its political and economic power and interests, as well as its implicit endorsement of Western cultural superiority, Euro-American psychology has positioned itself as the universal psychology that applies to all of humanity. It often denounces other global traditions of psychology, like Indian psychology, as cultural or indigenous, but sees itself as acultural, objective, and scientific. It does this through purporting other psychologies as biased and comparatively less globally useful, even when applied within their own countries of origin. So now Indian psychology scholars are increasingly reflecting on the devastating impact that adopting foreign psychologies has had on the Indian populace, including but not limited to their mental health, identity development, employment and business practices, and reduced ability to access effective indigenous healing practices. Yet such knowledge and critique often gets overshadowed for several reasons, such as a lack of sufficient knowledge mobilization for such a small but growing body of critical psychological literature that challenges hegemonic ideas in psychology. So in line with that, the purpose really is to better mobilize such knowledge and promote application. Our speaker today is Dr. Sunil Bhatia. The talk is called Psychology in India, Reflections on Coloniality, Power, and Marginality. So with that said, I will turn my screen off here and I'll turn it over to our speaker.
Thank you, Rubinder. Let me try to share my screen. Second. There it is.
Great. All right. It's on the screen, so I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you. Sorry. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Bedi and Dr. Varma for inviting me to the speaker series. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here and speak about coloniality in India. Has been central to my work, not just now, but going back almost 2 decades. So I want to start by really talking about how I got into questions of decoloniality and why I think it's really important to decolonize not just Indian psychology, but mainly Eurocentric psychology and the hold that it has had, or many other psychologies across the world. So I really I want to begin by talking about why one needs to situate one's positionality in relationship to the knowledge that's being generated. Positionalities are not fixed. They don't merely reflect demographic diversity, rather depositionality, I believe, pushes us to think about our social location as relational accountability and building creative coalitions. What I mean by this is that as we pursue decolonial knowledge, or as we undo the systems of coloniality, we also have to think of ourselves as knowledge makers who are in relationship and situated to many other decolonial scholars or critical scholars who are questioning coloniality in parts of Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, and of course, India, which I'm talking about right now. So if you have to, in some ways, usurp or undo the systems of exploitation and domination that are symbolic of Eurocentric modernity, we really have to think through creative coalitions, but also understand what local spaces that are we speaking from, and how do we come to questions of coloniality and decolonization. For example, let me just give you these four photographs. This is Pune, my town where I grew up, and this is remnants, or so to speak, histories of British colonialism that are still present in the what I would call in modern India. So here on the left is, these are the British soldiers sitting in their Southern Command barracks, and on the right, as you can see, a constable not far away from my home. This used to be the street that I would take to go to my school. And you could see, this is, I think, a picture taken in 1890, sorry. And about 100 years later, the street had not significantly changed, but you could see the relics, not just of the past, but they're there in the terms they have shaped the city. And here on the left, you see pictures. These pictures I have to give credit to Thornton, who runs a Facebook page on East India Company, who has posted some of these pictures there. On the left, you see these British civil servants who are part of the Raj and imperialism, and who were brutal and in their extraction, looting, and exploitation of India over more than 2 centuries, just celebrating. And these are postcards from Pune. So disconnected from the very cruelties that they were unleashing on Indian citizens and Indian people at that time, including, I would say, my ancestors. And the right is the university, which was the governor's mansion, British governor's mansion. This is University of Pune, where I went to. So to discard and to say somehow colonialism is the past is to make a mistake. Colonialism is now and has also shaped our modern global order. British colonization, I think, important to understand. If you're speaking about psychological knowledge, psychology played an important role in being complicit with the project of colonization. So policies created famines that killed over 35 million Indians. Another million people died, and more than 13 million became displaced during the violent partition of India in 1947. And some of these facts are recorded recently is, of course, Tharoor's book, but also many other books on Indian history. I think the place where it's important to talk about British colonial knowledge is the way they used social science to justify the description of my ancestors, and maybe ancestors who are in the audience listening, as animals, primitive, rude, backward, lazy, ignorant, including Churchill called them a beastly people. So when I got to do psychology, I was taught at the same time that 7 years of psychology that I learned that British and European theories of people and culture were more correct, more legitimate, and superior to Indian culture and history. And this is sort of important because this was the syllabus that I was given and taught for 7-8 years throughout my curriculum, this larger history of British imperialism and in the way social science was complicit, especially psychology, was not a part of my curriculum at all. And only later on in my work that I discovered that. So a lot of my stories that I was growing up with outside the university, they were completely erased in the syllabus. So theories of identity, questions of culture and subjectivity. So growing up in the public streets of life, looking at celebrations that were very religious centered, for example, in the public life in India that we see right now, were absolutely not considered to be important or valid in the questions that I was bringing to class. So the really dichotomy or interesting paradox was culture was all around us. In fact, we were told as we were growing up that we may not have the advanced materialism of the West, but what we possessed was the sociocultural wisdom of 2,500 years as defined by Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Islam and Sikhism, and so many other traditions where self was so quintessential in its understanding of how to be in the world and what is the role of culture and self. But many of these discourses were not allowed in the classroom. So there was a kind of culture was seen almost as a contaminated variable. And that's where you saw what one would call coloniality present throughout the syllabus. So Indian psychology was not just discarded, but was also considered as irrational. So you have a large number of psychologists in India, and I don't want to rehash this because they have done some tremendous, profound work, Professor Misra, Professor Paranjape, and others who have spoken about how Indian psychologists were not just culture blind, but also were suspicious of Indian psychology and were not able to integrate indigenous, so to speak, frameworks within the psychological frameworks that were being studied, analyzed in the universities, for example. And now more recently, Savaria has spoken about psychologists in India also not engaging with questions of caste and most importantly, yet to reflect on the influence of caste on theoretical frameworks and practices within discipline. So it was both the majority of psychological research wasn't focusing on some of the dominant traditions, as well as some of the questions of marginality and the way it was affecting what we would call the construction of the Indian self. And that's something has been articulated by Nandi and many others psychologists who have spoken about the concept of culture and complicated it, including Professor Chaudhary, for example, and Professor Misra and Professor Paranjape and so on. So I won't go over many of these scholarly contributions I've already made, for example. But here's just a kind of summary of it, the ways in which silence and erasure of Indian subjectivity and in Indian psychology and psychology in India has had. There's been no space for meaning making of culture and personal experience. There's an embrace of colonial and scientific method as the only valid methodology. The reduction of culture, knowledge, and power to variables. It was there when I did my coursework for 2 years in University of Pune. It continued, and some of this continued, my mind to say, within my education in the United States as well. So the colonial framework was not just being reproduced within the context of India, but also within the context of United States and Europe, for example. So Western psychological knowledge was considered as canonical. Framing of local Indian psychology was often irrational and scientific. Psychology was seen disconnected from social cultural realities of caste, religion, and oppression, so to speak, of marginalized groups. Also questions of poverty, questions of access to knowledge, to education were relegated to, for example, economics or sociology rather than confronting them straightforward because if sociocultural issues dominate within the context of India, so do class issues, but they were never really taken up within the syllabus as such. And academic success was measured by coloniality of knowledge as formed within the so-called American Eurocentric systems. That is, who gets rewards, who gets, who's mobile and who's academically mobile and so on. You could see, for example, here in Indian psychology, and this is just, I took a screenshot from the recent iteration of University of Pune, where I studied. You can see Indian psychology right there as a separate discipline, in addition to experimental, mathematical, clinical, educational. And here is an opportunity to think about why is Indian psychology, which is such a rich tradition of theory, reflection, analysis, interpretation, going back a couple of thousand years, is just given one line as opposed to should be central in some ways. And the other, so to speak, disciplines should be integrated in a way that reflects the strength of psychology in India. And so 21, 22 years ago, I wrote about, in one of my critiques, my first papers on Orientalism in Euro-American psychology and Indian psychology, and how historical representations of natives were constructed in colonial and post-colonial contexts. And I write about, for example, not just Indian psychology, but the way the racism of the founders of American and Euro-American psychology contributed in very direct ways to constructing very dehumanized narratives and depictions of people in India and Africa at that time. And that supposedly so-called science was used to justify the oppression of large numbers of people, masses of humanity. So by military colonization, political colonization, educational colonization, it was very extractive, and it was based on exploitation and dehumanization of people. But this was knowledge used, for example, by some very key founders. It was then taken up by politicians. So, and I continue this work 25 years later in Decolonizing Psychology, which was published in 2018, to speak about the way, for example, how neocolonialism, neoliberalism, through mechanism globalization, has now entered into not just South Asia, but in different parts of the world. But my location was 3 different communities within India that I was studying. One of my questions was guided by the fact that there are 356 million Indian youth in there, but their lives are completely overlooked and barely mentioned in the canon of psychology, especially Eurocentric psychology. They're either flatten their lives, depicted as caricatures, or very Orientalist terms are used to understand them. One of the points made by weird studies is that an American undergraduate student is 4,000 times more likely to be a randomly selected as a subject for research than a random non-Westerner. You can see, for example, the masses of humanity, and for example, also in Africa and Latin America, are invisible, omitted. And part of understanding decolonial psychology is to understand their lives in very meaningful contexts and to provide a framework that is not just indigenous, but also connects to the political, psychological frameworks that are used and built by drawing on traditions that are available to us, which might be called indigenous or critical indigenous psychologies. So the 3 questions that grounded my research is: how did Euro-American psychology advance a project of racism, slavery, and empire building in constructing this kind of colonial psychology? Then what role does colonialism and coloniality of Euro-American psychological knowledge plays in the construction of selfhood, subjectivity in contemporary working, middle, and upper class Indian urban communities? So I did work over several years within these 3 communities and understanding ways in which Eurocentric discourses of self were traveling there, and of course being reframed within the local context of family and tradition. It wasn't like they were wholesale just taking and adding as is, but these were very dominant discourses in the classroom with the rise of liberal arts colleges, in the workspaces, for example, on self-actualization and peak experiences and so on. And the question 3rd was: how do we co-imagine, co-dream, and sustain a decolonial psychology when conditions of colonialism and slavery and racism are still present within our society? So the issue was to really think about the 2 sides of modernity coloniality. One is what we normally receive as Eurocentric modernity, with its emphasis on industrialization, democracy, secularization, humanism, linear time, scientific reasoning. And that's sort of given to us as over 500 years as part of Enlightenment rationality. But what's missing is, and Roti talks about this, indigenous genocide, dispossession, Black slavery, subjection, exploitation of labor, ecocide, white supremacist and heteropatriarchal immigration policies, compulsory heterosexuality, gendered violence, imperialism, and that's where colonialism, for example, these are part of so-called allures of modernity, but we don't sort of hear that within our psychological texts as such. So colonization and modern global order today are, we have inherited the modern global order from the principles and from colonization that occurred in different parts of the world over 200, 300, 400 years, depending on the region you were in. So colonization, I think, understanding is that it was based on extermination, pillage, enslavement, racialization, dehumanization, and imposition of power. And by 1914, Europe had the grand total of roughly 85% of the earth as colonies, protectorates, dependencies, dominions, and commonwealths. And I mentioned Said's quote here because it's important to understand that coloniality and colonialism was a global project spanning the entire earth, and that's why decolonial thought is highly situated. There's a decolonial thought coming from postcolonial theory, from decolonial theory, from indigenous psychology, and there's coming from Latinx theorists and American Indian theorists and indigenous and First Nations here, and each one are situated very differently. And we really have to map out these different ideas of decoloniality and coloniality and see what's incommensurate, and also where we are coming from when we are advancing, for example, our own decolonial projects. So decolonizing, in a definition that I work with and I like by my colleagues Kessie Marks and Ramagundo, is decolonizing entails a political and normative ethic of resistance, intentional undoing, unlearning, dismantling unjust practices, assumptions, institutions, as well as persistent positive action to create and build alternative spaces, networks, and way of knowing that transcend our epicolonial inheritance. The term epicolonial borrows the prefix epi to refer to features of coloniality that pervade and supersede systems and relations of power. So epicolonial dynamics are phenomenon for which the cause may or may not be directly traced to the legacies or histories of overt or observed colonial encounters, but which when power relations and outcomes are recognizably colonial. So this goes with what Professor Bedi introduced at the beginning in his remarks, was these are epicolonial dynamics that this is our inheritance, this is our knowledge, this is what we're living with in our daily practices, for example, and which is why Euro-American psychology continues also to be one of the important gatekeepers in its relationship to the knowledge that's coming out of the global South. And so understanding these power relationships as a result of global coloniality is very key in understanding how coloniality continues to affect knowledge production, for example. So here's Stanley Hall, the founder of American Psychological Association, which I go into an elaborate work in my own book on decolonizing psychology, says history has recorded that each of the great races has developed upon the basis of a lower one, and our progress has been so amazing that we read our title, Clear to Dominion. If they linger, they must take up our burden of culture and work. This sentiment has found several remarkable expressions in Europe within the last few years, both by soldiers and thinkers. And so you can see, for example, how deadly and dangerous this is. And the founder of American psychology, and also the founder of the department in which, one of the founders of the department in which I got my PhD at Clark University, writing about how we could use both soldiers and thinkers to think about for making sure that the people in Africa and Asia take up this work of ideas set up by Europeans, for example. But it's a very blatant, in some ways, call, you could say, for wiping out our local populations here. So one of the questions we have when we think of coloniality is, what does epistemological retrieval mean? So it's to kind of, how do we move from decolonizing? And one place I think that helps us make our move is the epistemological decolonizing, but it involves dismantling the colonial structure of the academy within different parts of the world, not just in India, but also here within the United States, because these questions are relevant here as well as in India. What counts as knowledge? Whose knowledge is valid? Who controls the production of knowledge? Who's deemed an expert? And whom are we accountable in our research, and for what purposes? So within the context of the United States, one question to ask is, what does it mean to do indigenous retrieval that speaks to stolen lands, stolen lives, and stolen labor? Similar questions can be framed within the context of India too. What does it mean to talk about indigenous retrieval when some of the traditions have been completely either buried or made invisible, or rendered as irrational or superstitious, or seen as, for example, having no purpose for what a good life is, or what selfhood means, for example. So one definition that we need to think about when we talk about colonialism is coloniality. So coloniality refers to long-standing patterns of power that emerge as a result of colonialism, but they define culture and intersubjective relations and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. It is maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-images of people, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. And this is Maldonado-Torres, his famous comment, points to how we continue to breathe coloniality. It's very similar to the question of epicolonial inheritance that I spoke about. And that is what I want to bring your attention to, the long-standing patterns of power that are maintained in academic performance and cultural patterns. And that's what you see in knowledge production today in Global South as well. So I'll give you three examples: coloniality of power, that you could see that I saw in my own work, coloniality of knowledge, and coloniality of being. So just give you three quick examples, and then I'll conclude with what implications are there where we can go from here. We can see, for example, call centers in India, some place I've done my work, um, as an example of how English language, as part of the so-called colonial language, is used to provide accent training, provide a particular kind of global speech that is very much used, and also psychological discourses of what it means to engage in interfacing with these so-called customers in the US and in Australia. So my colleague and I, Dr. Kumar Ravi Priya, and myself, and including my book, we have analyzed how MBTI is often used by human resource departments in Indian IT corporations and call centers, because seen as providing companies and trainers a method for scientifically measuring and quantifying personal growth and actionable goals. So I've looked at how these psychometric tests are taken up, not just here in India, but they're also being taken up in China and parts of Africa. These are very Eurocentrically constructed. And they're part of sort of this transnational organizations where they filter into ideas about workshops, about diversity and cultural difference and collectivism and individualism. And they're being interestingly taken up and asked and pushed on certain employees, but they belong to the local South. But that coloniality knowledge is really about knowledge production. Sort of where is knowledge constructed from, and where is it being distributed, and where is it imposed, for example. You can see in examples Bhatia talks about. She's a sociologist. She speaks about how Americans are seen as linear, active, methodical, privacy, having punctual, whereas Indians are seen as inquisitor, multitasking, unpredictable. And so you see some of the interesting Orientalist, very of this collectivist, individualistic language that what I have called corporate cross-cultural psychology in my own work. And much of these details I do give in much more depth in my articles. And finally, coloniality of being is another way to think about that I said earlier. As you could see, not just in India, but also parts of Africa and parts of other parts of Asia, where call center workers are subjected to hours of training in accent reduction, communication style, voice modulation, personality development. An Indian customer service worker carries the burden of being far away from their Western clients while simultaneously being intimate in their conversation. So they have to come across, Mirchandani talks about this in her work, as who are capable of understanding and emphasizing with them from a distance, but yet interestingly very local. In some ways, they have to be seen as somewhat similar or somewhat subordinate in terms of how they appear as part of this neoliberal and outsourcing practices. So what I mean by being is that these discourses of power and knowledge are impacting selfhood in the way we understand things like self-actualization, self-esteem, ideas about smartness, about beauty, about intelligence, and so on. And many Indian sociologists have also pointed out too. So these are not just taken up willy-nilly wholesale as they're constructed. They are embedded within those local practices, but they also in some ways become dominant as such. And I've shown and articulated in my work in different articles and how they become this coloniality or being becomes. And there is a resistance to it too. So I want to be very clear of the fact that there are other youth who also dismiss this and embrace an indigenous tradition and sort of, but yet, because this is within the context of transnational power and organizations, it's harder to go against some of these, and they have power attached to it as such. And finally, my colleague, Dr. Bhatia Priya, and I have looked in our paper also coloniality of power as an internal colonialism, not just the external colonialism or the colonialism of Europe, but for example, caste hierarchies. So the burden of preserving the millennial-old caste system and caste-out-caste relationship is mainly carried by Dalits if they tend to disturb the psychological equilibrium of established caste-related norms. For instance, the Dalit Bhutmange family in Maharashtra faced sexual assault and death in 2008 due to their support for Ambedkar's ideas of Dalit equality and education. So my colleague and I did an analysis of the global mental health movement, the ways in that, for example, Eurocentric psychology plays a work, but also ways in which neoliberalism has increased some of these caste atrocities that Tel Tamre talks about in his work. And these are some of the articles where I've articulated many of these ideas recently. And I'll be happy to send some copies to you if you can email me, for example. So where do we go from here is how do we move past this? What do we do? I've given you a broader story of the coloniality. But I think one way we can do to get very concrete is epistemological decolonization. So when we think of indigeneity, we need to think about what Nadlevo Gestani, an African scholar, talks about epistemic freedom. So how do we dismantle privileged Euro-American epistemologies? What does reframing pathologizing accounts of marginality mean? What does it mean to reclaim histories and reframe erasure of histories? So I think we need to deconstruct colonial discourses and insert counter narratives. We have to foreground indigeneity and indigenous knowledge in the curriculum, but also critical indigenous knowledge as well that speaks to questions of marginality. So it can't just be speaking to European, but also colonialities that are formed within this and they combine, and that's harder to tease apart, for example. Foregrounding the politics of knowledge production, inserting embodied author identities and positionalities. Where are we speaking from, for example, is important. Activism, community-based knowledge central to the pedagogical learning and outside classrooms. Pedagogical tools employed as catalysts for critical reflexivity. Drawing on ecologies of knowledge appropriate to context. So this is Carolison and Deckard in the special issue give us these sort of 10 features that we can think about in terms of not just decolonizing the subject matter, but even the way in which it is taught from a point of view of decolonizing the university. So the question to ask is, where does psychology live today? Universities, communities, traditions, religion. And if we are going to be decolonizing or using a framework, then the context in which so much reading, writing, thinking, theorizing happens within the university, it's still very deeply colonial. There is a lot there that needs to be decolonized as well. The second question is, for example, as part of that epistemological decolonization, here is Savaria speaking about her experiences of marginality. She says, during internship after post-graduation, I was made to sit and I was told to observe from outside. The door of experience and the therapeutic process were closed, which restricted my learning. This was a major encounter with the purity-pollution divide inside the clinic, with it was an authority imposed on me to accept my presence as a contaminated subject. The experiential sense of humiliation questioned my worthiness in this subject. And for the first time, I realized how even the therapeutic training methods and processes had no recognition for my existence as a human and my dignity, worth, capability as a learner. So the experiences result in the erosion of emotional expressions, which further led to distressing thoughts and reactions. Here is an example of how do we then include questions of caste oppression if we are speaking in an Indian psychology or psychology in India. And here is a psychologist who has written about counseling psychology and what does it mean to be a Dalit and a non-Dalit doing counseling within the context of India, for example. So this is one thing for us to think about. I don't have a settled answer to this way we go, but here are some questions to kind of raise. So the other question we think about when we think about Indian and Indian psychology and psychology in India, this sort of raises questions about who gets to be counted, seen, valued, recognized, and understood as an Indian, and whose psychology and whose histories do we center, and whom do we omit and devalue and silence. So it's not just about Indian psychology. I think there are two key words and frames here that we have to think about when we think about coloniality. That Indian itself is a contested term, and psychology in India, it has implications for it. For example, Kilnani, a historian, talks about um, uh, um, that democracy in the American context and French context provided very different understanding of nationhood, freedom, community, public good, social equality. And he speaks about that these were experiments, and Indian democracy is one of the most important experiments, or it's a third moment in this experimentation. And he says, this experimentation has released immense energies, each raised towering expectations, and each has suffered tragic disappointments. And the Indian experiment is still in its early stage, and its outcome may well turn out to be the most significant of them all, partly because of the sheer human scale and partly because of its location, a substantial bridgehead of effervescent liberty on the Asian continent. And so how we think about pluralism, epistemological pluralism within the Indian context and debates about citizenship have a real importance for psychology, and psychology has a role to play in understanding of what these different forms of Indian psychology mean. So teaching about decoloniality is not the same as teaching decolonially, and that would be important because it would be impossible. It would be possible to teach, for example, the principles of decoloniality in a manner that mimics local processes, um, um, in a manner that mimics local processes of transmitting a body of received knowledge to what are assumed to be ignorant students. However, to teach decoloniality requires a transformation in teaching process as much as in the ideas being communicated. This is Blanche, Fourie, and Sigalo talking about the difference between teaching decoloniality and teaching decolonial. And that, I think, is one of the key questions to think about as we think about coloniality also. So if we are talking about the university, the community, the structures and institutions, and the syllabuses are very powerful mode in which decolonizing happens. So to think about what does it mean to teach Indian psychology, and what are the consequences of teaching Indian psychology or psychology in India within the, what is the pushback? What is the resistance? Who's resisting for what purposes, and where the power is coming from, and so on. And finally, I think colonial wounds and decolonial understanding within the history of psychology is very important. We've kind of, in our own understanding of psychology and coloniality, we should not forget the history of psychology. And we have to also understand that colonialism does not cry, grieve, or acknowledge the losses of those they colonized and their descendants. It expects those they colonized to cry for them. This is the black mourning of white supremacy. It is obscene, it is enraging, and this process begins by creating sacred spaces to pour out the epic pain, grief, and anger due to colonialism. This is Esther Emra talking about colonialism and grief, what it means within the context of Queen Elizabeth's death, and she speaks about how we rewrite histories, and how we had given so much attention to a monarchy which was embedded within centuries of colonialism, but yet we had not sort of given enough attention to how that monarchy had, for example, suppressed and colluded in very actively, or was born of the moment of the colonial project. And so similarly, we have to ask questions really, is that we somehow seem to be rushing to think about undoing colonial, moving into the decolonial without really thinking about what colonialism has done. And I think has to be a much more deeper understanding within different situated understandings, not just within Indian context or the university or department, the community or the country, but also within, as I said, global coloniality, because this colonial wound, so to speak, or cultural imperialism as Saeed speaks about, was across much of this earth. But we have not yet had, within the context of psychology, any time to think about, in terms of theory, concepts, embodiment, what does it mean to have lived through colonialism, what it has done to our subject matter. So this question of grief is not just a kind of individual grieving process, but collectively, what does it really mean to acknowledge the losses of language, the losses of indigeneity, and some of the current systems that we have inherited, which are still controlled, for example, by Eurocentric modernity. And how do we understand the anger that is there present within many neo-colonial, post-colonial contexts that we live with. So this is sort of one story that I presented of coloniality and undoing. There are, of course, obviously others, and this is not the most exhaustive one, so it's partial and incomplete in some ways. And I understand that, but given the time and space, given the time that we have, I'm going to stop here. And so thank you very much for listening.
Great. Oh, thank you so much for that. I'm just going to share one thing on the screen here. Second. There we go. And okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for that. I want to let the audience know that rather than use the chat feature, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says Q&A. If you could please click the Q&A button and then type up any questions or comments that you have, and then I will read them over to Dr. Bhatia. And so just to give people a few minutes to type up their questions, Dr. Bhatia, maybe I'll ask the first question or two, and then I'll turn it over to the audience, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So my first question is what really got you interested in this avenue of research? Is there like a turning point or a set of experiences, but why did you choose researching this over the other millions of topics that could have sparked your interest and your research?
I think part of the reason, when I started as a graduate student many years ago, I spent 7 years in India. My education happened in India, and I came to the US to study. I experienced a kind of different forms of colonial mindset within the Indian education system, as well as another form of colonial mindset within the American university system. Some had common shared, I would say, the family resemblances. Even within the context of the United States, I found in my syllabus, there was a kind of erosion, or the way they sort of, when they talked about culture and identity and subjectivity, a large number of Indian scholars, whom I mentioned earlier, who were working and pioneering some of those views, that was completely absent within the context, within the psychology that I was reading. My own experiences, for example, about alienation and discrimination were really central to understanding where does coloniality live. I didn't have the language at that point, but I developed it, especially when I came across post-colonial thinkers such as Said and Spivak and Baba and many others, including Nandi. They kind of brought in a kind of awakening of consciousness that I had to go to other disciplines to bring in within what I was thinking of, how to provide a culturally constituted psychology that seems to pay attention to these local questions of power and knowledge. And that's what brought it. So some of that was the discipline not speaking to me, not speaking to my experience. And some of it, what I was seeing, the discipline not speaking to experiences of a large number of migrants, large number of folks who were in previously colonized countries. So there was absolutely no discussion, for example, about whiteness, the power of whiteness, or what colonialism had wrought in parts of Asia and Africa, and how so many of the key founders, including in my university, the so-called Euro-American psychology, were advancing a form of kind of racism, and including proponents of, scientific racism that bordered on deep racism that was taken up in the subject matter. So it was not just knowledge production of these theories, but they were considered as vanguard pioneers. And this history that we were talking about, which is our inheritance of psychology, was not mentioned at all. So there was a kind of politics of representation that was really skewed and quite dangerously skewed in what was considered to be, who was considered to be a psychologist and what psychology meant and for whom.
Mhm. Great. Okay. Well, my next question, I appreciate, I see some few questions have popped in here. So I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll turn it over to the audience questions. Again, if you weren't, if you missed it, at the bottom of your screen is a Q&A button. Please click that button and type up your question. So my second and last question before I turn it over, Dr. Bhatia, is, have you ever got any significant pushback or some difficulties in sort of progressing down this avenue of research? In other words, other colleagues or at conferences, or just any sort of significant pushback that's made it a barrier to keep going?
I think inevitably when I started doing this work of writing my first paper almost 20 years ago, I'd done two papers. One was rethinking acculturation from postcolonial context, and this one was rethinking psychology from the frame of Orientalism, and several others. And this did not have much currency, or at that time I was told very much that this kind of writing and publication would be seen as against the establishment and the status quo. And firstly, they would not be published. And second, I'm taking a very contrarian approach, or I'm actually dissenting and calling out the so-called racism and discrimination of the racism deeply embedded within psychology. Other Black psychologists had spoken about this earlier. Women of color, feminists had been speaking about it, and I understood that it invites a kind of a scrutiny on you, and you're not considered as sort of mainstream. And so I've articulated some of that in my interview that I gave in Mad in America. It was a podcast of being shunned, of being considered not a psychologist, but really as someone who works in the realm of underrepresented minorities, or like an ethnic psychologist. So the real psychology was being done by so-called Americans, and then this work was seen as just a critique, so to speak, and not of any building any. And then all the reviews process. Most amount of pushback you get is by reviewers who are very threatened by some of this work, because it challenges some of the, when I was writing at that time, all my reviewers were mostly within the United States, and they were pushing back against it. So it took many, for that first piece, I had two reviewers, for example, who did not think that it was, that colonialism is relevant anymore, or the racist inheritance is there within psychology. They were very vociferously against me publishing that. And so I had to move through so many reviews, and luckily the editor was somewhat sympathetic to this viewpoint. But at that point, I didn't think even 10 individuals would be reading this work, because there were very few doing it. So there was the so-called peer pressure to not take on this work because it prevents academic mobility. And the critical elements was also seen that you are, you would be, ostracized, for example. So some of that, I would say, I personally experienced, but also later on, as I kept sort of going, I was also part of a moment, so to speak, multicultural, decolonial, critical, feminist narrative turn was occurring that was very helpful, in which my work started getting couched. But it took several years, I would say almost a decade, to not be almost going against the current.
Great, wonderful. Okay.
So yeah, and I think what's important is to kind of think about the emotional toll that also takes when you do this work. and Black psychologists and other Asian American psychologists have spoken about this within your own university systems. And I think undermining the affective labor of doing this work, I think, is something we should not dismiss at all, because there are forces that are working to discredit sometimes this work as well.
Great. Yeah, definitely could be an uphill battle for sure. Okay, well, let's turn it over to some of the questions here. Okay, the first question, let's go to here. Okay, the first question is from Ivan. The question says, what is typically the target population of Indian psychology studies? Is it usually university and graduates like in the West?
Yes, I would say it's not just university graduate. I mean, researchers are writing for a large population. You have generations of psychologists who have tried to take their work beyond just universities, students. Psychology happens of learning primarily, but there's also an effort to bring it into the community and speak to, real issues that different communities are facing. So if you take 2 volumes on Oxford volume on Indian psychology and psychology in India with Professor Misra edited, you will see a wide range of articles in it, which are very much based on parenting, to cognitive science, to adolescence, and then there's an article by Ashish Nandi in the end speaking about, nationalism and so on. So I would say, while the transmission of formal psychology happens within the university, but researchers increasingly speak about large societal concerns as well. And I think in some ways, that's been one of the mantle of Indian psychology.
Great. Okay. The next question. I am a former clerky, and so I'm excited to attend your talk. My previous research has involved a sample of South Indians, and I found it extremely hard to do this research because of time and difficulty getting institutional support in India. In the context of curriculum in India, why do you think there is resistance to Indian psychology in the classroom?
Well, first of all, hello to this Clarky. That's a really interesting question, and I didn't fully get the question. If you can repeat,
you can actually click. You can click the Q&A in the bottom if you want to read it as well.
Yeah, is it?
It says questions from Achu. I'll read it out again. I am a formal clerky, and so I'm excited to attend your talk. My previous research has involved a sample of South Indians, and I found it extremely hard to do this research because of time and difficulty getting institutional support in India. In the context of curriculum in India, why do you think there is resistance to Indian psychology in the classroom?
Yeah, I think it's for the very reasons I mentioned here, those 9 reasons earlier, that part of it is, of course, what we value. We consider, Indian psychology, as many Indian psychologists have argued, tends to draw on philosophical principles in many different religions, as well as important ideas about self and identity that don't square all the time well with what we call as a scientific model. So it's kind of ironical because the modern psychology is only 50, 100 years, whereas Indian psychology span is much more expansive. So the work, for example, of Professor Paranjape on indigenous and other forms of psychology, including Hindu psychology, is about retrieving ideas and abstractions about self that we know. For example, they don't necessarily need to be replicated. It's like Vipassana tradition, in Buddhist psychology is 2,000 years old. We know it's worked, it's transmitted across. But we somehow have this understanding, or that's where hegemony comes in, is that we need scientific validity, for example. So it was not just enough that these philosophical, psychological ideas survived, thrived and were very important to a society for all these years. But somehow we need MRIs and we need Western thinkers and we need quantification. And so part of it is the cult of quantification has become the god in psychology, so to speak. And in that sense, when we think about questions of personality and consciousness, these are not easily amenable to study scientifically as well. And the question is always whether is that the only valid form. So when you bring that into the classroom, I think part of our mindset is that we still are, if you look at the list that I gave you earlier, psychology of mathematics, psychology of experiments. In some ways, since I went to that university, not much has changed, and Indian psychology is relegated to just one small subject as such. So I'm not against the others. It's just that one wants to give equal attention to it. And there are many other questions. It's like gatekeeping. Part of it is also the structures of what counts as knowledge is constructed in the global north. And there's a lot of gatekeeping and questions of prestige and status that are attached to what kind of psychology is permitted and who within. So it's not the individuals in these universities in Asia or in Africa that we should be somehow consider them responsible. It's also the larger structures in which knowledge gets, this is what I meant by coloniality of being and coloniality of knowledge gets circulated, where you feel that your survival is dependent on the validation of, and that's why you choose, for example, these other forms of knowledge. And you feel that these are my evaluators. These are the publications in the global north that will be telling me that this is a knowledge that's valid. And I could give a much more longer answer, and I've written in many articles why, and I've done a critique of it, which, I would suggest to my fellow clerky to, look up if they're interested.
Good. Okay. Next question from Namita. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Bhatia. The question is about how would it be possible to deconstruct this coloniality now in our systemic thinking per se, for example, in psychotherapy modalities, workspace, and social dialogues?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is to kind of first understand where coloniality resides, like what systems are we using in our place. So if you're talking about psychotherapy, Professor Bedi was mentioning to me in his, our chat before that as he was traveling in India, he saw most of the textbooks in counseling psychology come from the same text, right? And it is Western. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are reading Alan Ivy's counseling skills textbook.
Right. And I think we have to sort of think about to what extent these within the therapeutic context, what do we mean by oppression? What do we mean by, what does clinical mean? And how do we speak to the sociocultural realities to the ground in a way that makes sense for both the therapist and the client and the concerns they're bringing, the issues. So to willy-nilly just use frameworks from here doesn't make sense. So first we have to identify what knowledge are we bringing to the therapeutic and clinical situation within the context. And second, I think what tools are available, theories about self, theories about healing. If in the therapeutic context we do, for example, liberation or healing, then does it make sense to talk about DBT? Does it make sense to talk about counseling psychology that was originated within America with particularly white population, and then derive that and just apply to context there? And so having an understanding, I think it's important. And then also pushing boundaries within the university system that many Indian psychologists are doing to look at what else is present there in the systems of psychology, or within not formal psychology, but also within other philosophical systems provided by some of the so-called religious or even secular understandings of self that are present there that one can draw on. But that sometimes means doing this work on yourself to understand how do I draw on certain particular traditions, depending on the religious sociocultural background? class plays a really important role within the Indian context in the sociocultural reality. So if you look at questions of selfhood within India have to be tackled in questions of modernity, tradition, postcoloniality, neoliberalism, globalization, and the religious frameworks that hold many of these. So it's not easy to unpack each, but a self that comes into the clinical context has all these histories with them, including caste, if you add now that to that. And to speak to that within an urban and rural context is very different as well. So one needs to be familiar with systems that speak to all of these conditions that the person that brings in. And that requires a lot of work, and to also look at what texts, what ideas have been circulated by other psychologists in India, which speak to all of these layers of selfhood.
Great. Okay. The next question is from Rachana. Rachana says, thanks for the wonderful presentation. In your teaching, have you ever experienced resistance from students to indigenous or decolonized psychological concepts? If yes, what might be the reasons for this and how have you dealt with it?
I think, as I said to you earlier, this is a really good question, is that anytime, I think when you do decolonial psychology or psychology that unsettles a system, or whether it is racism, whiteness, casteism, what you see is that those sometimes who hold these categories very dearly and are part of the, say, dominant groups also experience a kind of discomfort in the classroom because you're challenging their worldview, they're challenging their systems, for example. And so they can either shut down, or sometimes the way they push back is not participate in the very discussions that you're happening. So for example, I would teach psychology of migration. I would talk about second generation South Asians and other migrants, what does it mean to navigate for them a society in which white power, white supremacy, reigns dominant, and how this navigation, depending on their social cultural background, how this creates a kind of burden. What does it mean to be in this hyphenated space for say South Asian Americans, whether you are living, say, in Canada or being brought up in the United States, and they carry certain burdens of being foreigners, forever foreigners. And when you talk about this in a classroom that is multiracial, you see that there are some individuals who have not had that experience. So you, as a teacher, have to translate, or allow the students to translate. But some of the questions sometimes some students will raise are often inappropriate and offensive to some students, especially students of color or students of immigrants, for example. And you have to be very truthful in somehow not necessarily denigrating the student, but holding them respectfully, but yet saying that the very question they're asking needs to be reframed, because that question itself is problematic. And so it requires a certain kind of pedagogy in which there is pushback, there is resistance, and sometimes there is, as I said, shutting down and lack of communication. But and sometimes similarly, it happens in conferences too, when you present this work, because part of being decolonial is you're actually challenging the colonial mindset. And if it's a mindset that you have grown up with, the so-called colonial mentality, you're already questioning their worldview as such. But no change. That's why decolonial thinking is so much about unlearning. Without unlearning without unlearning what you've been socialized in, it's very hard to really do radical transformation. But part of radical transformation and pedagogy is to challenge very much that worldviews, that epistemologies. That's worldview. Another word for it is the knowledge that you're bringing either to your research or to your classroom. So, and I can, other places I've talked about the pushback and the resistance, but these are some examples I can give within the context of, and sometimes Professor Bedi and I was talking about, sometimes some of these articles that you publish and they just outrightly get rejected because they're seen as having not any significant importance to the work you do.
Okay, great. Okay, the next question is a long one, so I'll read it through and you may want to follow online. But it's from Jadhav. And so for the audience, I'll read it out here. Universities and psychiatry use an EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, I guess, lens, refusing the rethinking of colonial structures, the deeper collective grieving, the invisibility of ways of knowing, including ritual, myth, symbolic language, etc. In trying to open up spaces of discourse, the cultural axis has a small crack. Through this moment of ideological fragility with George Floyd, Indigenous rights, to open these questions, would you comment? Yeah, I mean, the crack is the moment of pursuing a community of colleagues who are willing to engage with this question. So if I just summarized it for the audience, I think what the speaker's saying is a lot of approaches like on university campuses and psychiatry use an EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion framework, but they refuse to rethink colonial structures, deeper collective grieving, or the invisibility of, or demonstrate the invisibility of other ways of knowing, including ritual, myth, and symbolic language. So I'll turn it over to you to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, Jaswant, I'm with you on that. Your critique is spot on about some forms of DEI that are very corporatized and very neoliberal, where resistance and understanding of resistance is itself being neoliberalized. It's highly individualized, and it comes with conceptual frameworks that only speak to diversity, because decolonization, decolonial thought is different from diversity. Diversity is still about thinking about inclusion and adding within the structure that's available to us, the colonial. Whereas decolonial is really questioning not just whether I have a seat at the table, but what is this table for? I need to dismantle it. It's like the tools of modernity or the tools that have been given is not enough. I need to completely, to decolonize, recreate new tools. And so I am actually here with you. And I think within the context of American Indian communities here, American Indian political thought within First Nations, for example, in Canada, they're increasingly provided the language of what decolonization means in terms of tribal sovereignty, in terms of repatriation of land, for example. And some of the scholars are not interested in questions of decolonizing a field as such. They're really interested in questions of what does it mean to get land back? What does it mean to honor treaties? What does it mean? What does retrieving mean in terms of language reclamation? So, and they're not interested in the questions of multicultural political forms of recognition and redistribution alone. It's a very different framework when you really think about questions of settler colonialism, where you start with questions about coloniality within the context of genocide and land. And so I don't think DEI in some of its forms embraces this or is even yet ready to take this on or speaks meaningfully, because for some of these scholars, the question of applying a decolonial framework or decolonization is not working with what the structures we have, is because some of these structures are beyond reform. And we need something more, like starting anew as such. So yes, I completely agree with you, Jaswant, in your analysis there. And so just added a few thoughts to what you said. I wish I could continue on and have this dialogue with you, but I'll just keep it at that for now.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question from Achu. What are some pressing research topics you would encourage scholars to explore decolonization in India, or to understand how colonialism affects the 21st century Indian psyche?
Within India, particularly?
That's what it sounds like. So what pressing topics would you encourage scholars to explore decolonization in India, or understand how colonialism affects the 21st century Indian psyche? So yeah, I think it does, particularly.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. And I want to be careful that I don't impose and dictate and say this is what I think. Say so. I want to be. I I think um, these questions are have to be come from communities of scholars that are residing in their lived realities. It is somewhat unethical at one level for me to sort of say that this should be the agenda or these should be the questions. I think so. I'm careful about my own positionality in which I sit from, and so that's having said that. That within a participatory framework, these questions are being raised within communities. For example, my colleague Dr. Bhatia Priya has done some amazing work on communal fundamentalism and questions about what does it mean to be underrepresented minorities experiencing conflict, and how mental health is not such an individual phenomenon, but there are socio-political determinants of suffering and healing that we have to attend to. Questions of citizenship. I mean, depends on, we can, one of the ones that I brought up earlier is articles that I've been reading on caste hierarchy. How can Indian psychology speak more carefully and in a very meaningful way to Dalit psychology or Dalit freedom and Dalit resistance, for example. So there are questions, I would say, about methodology, epistemology, about ethics, about politics. And then all of them are really important, crucial also for questions about bare citizenship, or what does it mean to, be living in what we call in different circuits of dispossession in India. So questions of livelihood. Their psychological questions of economics are not outside psychology, because they are about psychology of aspiration, psychology of scarcity. And so they're equally, so if we focus on questions of affluence alone, we also have to focus, for example, questions of circuits where people are disenfranchised or dispossessed, and what does it really mean on a daily basis to live, for example, within several social scientists were talking about what it meant during the pandemic for migrants who are in places like Mumbai and urban cities to make that trek back home under to experience police brutality, to experience starvation, to experience this kind of dispossession and displacement. A kind of, so questions to me, I think, of precarity, what it means to be precarious, and how that impacts your psychology, I think are really important questions when we think about within the context of India, are interesting.
Great, okay. And I will apologize in advance to the audience because we're not going to get to all the questions, but I do appreciate the engagement with people asking lots of questions. I think we have time for one more. And so the last question of the day is going to be, what role do you think cross-cultural psychology, Black psychology, Indigenous psychology play in decolonizing psychology?
Yeah, I think I would, because I've done critiques of cross-cultural psychology in my first 10 years, and they're all available, many of them. So I won't go into some of the cross-cultural, but I think Black psychology and Indigenous psychology do play a role. I think depends on what we mean by Indigenous psychology also. So there are some forms of Indigenous psychology within the context of Indigenous communities within North America and Americas as well, within sort of South America, that are really speaking about questions of self within the context of sociocentric forms of relationality, within questions of climate catastrophe, within questions of that are really important to tackle. And I would say Black psychology, has been very important. W.E. Du Bois's work is, I think, very instrumental in thinking about systems not just slavery, but how our current systems within the United States um, um, are part of a very colonial hierarchies, and that are still with us. And many Black scholars and African American scholars have provided some very important questions on insights on racial identity development, racial subjectivity within the context of racial hierarchies. That will be very important for us as we think about colonialism. So colonialism is not separate from racism. Questions of empire were built, as Annabel Quijano talks about. Race was very foundational to the colonial project. So racism, empire, slavery are sort of these three triads that were responsible. And Black psychologists, indigenous psychologists have spoken about the legacies and inheritances and given us certain concepts, whether to think about it, whether it's Steve Biko or talking about Black consciousness in South Africa, and many other South African psychologists writing, for example, Professor Kopano Ratale's book, What Does, on African-centered psychology, is very powerful in the ways it is articulating a framework for Africans based on African ideas and so on. So I would definitely argue for centering some of those works of indigenous, but also complicating, because it's not easy to say. Indigenous psychology also adopts some of these scientific frameworks that dilute some of the indigeneity or indigenous meanings that are there. So there are debates about what do we mean by indigeneity when so-called 500 million people today on this earth are considered to be indigenous. And a kind of recent article just was speaking about that who is indigenous, what claims are made, are sort of contested, and how do we go about this? I mean, there are First Nation people, American Indians, who are Aboriginal, the Adivasis. We know that, if we look at their sense of histories and where they come from, and they're the original inhabitants. But after that, who gets to be indigenous and how is a question that we have to take that up too.
Great, okay. So as we come soon to a close here, I want to thank Dr. Bhatia for sharing his knowledge and wisdom here. I also want to remind the audience that all talks on this series are posted online or will be posted online. We do have our first two talks already posted here. I sent out the link to the chat, but you can also search Dr. Betty's Research, Teaching, and Service Lab YouTube page, and there'll be an opportunity to look at that chat as well as other speaker series. But the Confronting Coloniality in Indian Psychology speaker series is all posted here. And Dr. Bhatia's talk should be posted up here within 2 weeks if you wish to watch it again or you wish to share it. With that said, let me again express my appreciation for Dr. Bhatia to give his talk, as well as for the audience who engaged us with more questions than we had time to answer. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful late evening if you're on the East Coast, early evening if you're on the West Coast, and early morning if you're in India. And whatever time zone you're in, I hope you have a wonderful day, and please stay tuned to future talks in this series.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation, Professor Bedi, and I look forward to the conversations and continuing collaboration. And thank you to the participants in all these zones that stayed up and, asked really provocative, interesting, engaging questions. Please write to me personally if you have questions. I would be happy to send you articles, but I hope we can continue this dialogue. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Bye.